My job for the last 18 years has been assembling cold steel machines. I spend my nights in a Detroit auto parts factory, surrounded by the deafening roar of hydraulic presses and the sharp bite of ozone in the air. The grease gets into your skin, nesting in the deep calluses of your palms, and no amount of scrubbing with industrial soap ever truly gets it out. It settles into the lifelines of your hands, a permanent marker of where you belong. But I never minded the grit. Not when I know that the greatest masterpiece of my life isn't made of metal or torque, but of flour, sugar, and a remarkably warm heart. My name is Will Barrett. Most folks on the factory floor just call me the night foreman. It is an honest, grueling living, the kind that breaks your back slowly over decades, trading your cartilage for a steady paycheck to put a roof over your family. And in my house, that roof sheltered a quiet kind of magic that I had no part in creating, only the profound privilege of protecting. My son Julian was 15. He wasn't the kind of kid who spent his weekends tearing up the football field or playing video games until his eyes bled. Julian was an introvert, a thinker, and as it turned out, a prodigy with a whisk and a convection oven. While I was managing the 2:30 a.m. production line, eating cold sandwiches out of a plastic container in a break room that smelled of bleach, Julian was in our kitchen. He was perfecting the exact lamination of a French croissant or the delicate temperamental rise of a Gruyere soufflé. I used to come home at dawn, my boots heavy with a 10-hour fatigue, only to be greeted by the rich golden scent of melting butter and caramelized sugar. Julian would be there, standing by the island counter, covered in a fine dusting of flour. He always had a fresh cup of chamomile tea waiting for me, brewed just the way I liked it. I had spent my entire adult life terrified he might end up following my footsteps onto the factory floor, chained to a time clock. But Julian had wings I couldn't even comprehend. For 6 agonizing months, that boy barely slept. He poured every ounce of his soul into preparing for the regional Le Cordon Bleu Junior Culinary Competition. It was the only chance he had at the single summer scholarship they offered each year. He researched old world techniques, maxed out our grocery budget on vanilla beans and imported chocolate, and practiced until his hands blistered from the heavy rolling pin. And then the letter arrived. It wasn't just a victory, it was a landslide. The local director of the institute, a seasoned veteran named Chef Maurice, had practically wept over Julian's final presentation. An intricate spun sugar sculpture, resting over a dark chocolate entremet. The prize was staggering. A full ride to their prestigious summer intensive program in Paris. $25,000 in tuition, completely covered by the academy, along with a $12,000 cash stipend, meant to handle his housing, travel, and living expenses for the duration of the program. I had already fronted that $12,000 from my own hard-earned savings into our joint family account, eager to get the wire transfer ready the moment he formally accepted. Seeing the tears in my son's eyes as he held that heavy, embossed acceptance letter. It was the kind of moment that makes 2 decades of factory night shifts feel like a divine privilege. His mother, however, saw things differently. Evelyn and I had been married for 16 years. Somewhere along the line, the woman I stood at the altar with had been replaced by a stranger I barely recognized. She was a woman consumed by the superficial, endlessly scrolling through social media, obsessively tracking the lavish vacations, designer bags, and cosmetic enhancements of her so-called friends in the wealthier suburbs of Birmingham. When Julian showed her the letter from Paris, Evelyn didn't pull him into a hug. She didn't shed a tear of pride. She just eyed the flour smudged across his apron with open distaste. She crossed her arms, the sleeves of her expensive silk robe rustling, and asked him why he couldn't be more like the neighbor's boy, a high school linebacker who was getting scouted by state colleges. Baking, to her, was a weak pursuit. It didn't offer the kind of aggressive, country club bragging rights she craved. It didn't fit the aesthetic of the life she felt she was owed. I remember the exact moment the shadow crossed her face. I was sitting at the kitchen table looking over the scholarship paperwork. Evelyn was leaning against the marble counter, applying a $60 anti-aging cream to her neck. She looked at the figure on the page, the $12,000 for living expenses. She didn't look at the tuition. She didn't look at the prestige of the academy. She just stared at that cash number, her eyes narrowing slightly. That is a ridiculous amount of money for a teenager to waste on French butter and sightseeing, she murmured, almost to herself. That stipend could do a lot of actual good around here. I've been talking to Dr. Vance about that mommy makeover package, the one the girls at the club all get. I brushed it off. I told her firmly that the money was Julian's, earned through his own sweat and undeniable talent, and that the funds in the joint account were earmarked solely for his Parisian housing. I thought that was the end of it. It was a foolish assumption. It was a Tuesday morning when the world tilted on its axis. I had just finished a brutal 14-hour shift at the plant due to a breakdown on the assembly line. But the deep ache in my lower back didn't matter. In the passenger seat of my beat-up truck sat a long, flat velvet box. Inside was a custom-engraved set of carbon steel pastry knives, a father's gift to his son. It was my way of transferring the cold, hard steel of my world into the refined, delicate artistry of his. Today was the day Julian was supposed to mail his signed acceptance letter to the academy. I pulled into the driveway, just as the sun broke over the horizon, anticipating the familiar smell of fresh pastries and the quiet pride in my son's eyes. I unlocked the front door, expecting a celebration. What I didn't know yet was that the silence in the house wasn't peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a shattered dream. The first thing that hit me when I opened the front door wasn't the smell of yeast or the rich aroma of melted chocolate. It was the smell of chemical citrus from the floor cleaner. The kitchen was entirely dark, save for the pale blue glow of a laptop screen illuminating the far corner. There was no chamomile tea. There was no flour dusting the counter. I set my heavy steel-toed boots by the door, the velvet box clutching tightly in my left hand. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I saw him. Julian was sitting on the cold linoleum floor, wedged in the narrow space between the refrigerator and the pantry door. His knees were pulled tight to his chest, and his shoulders were shaking in violent, silent spasms. The kid was completely broken. It wasn't the loud, demanding cry of a teenager who had a privilege taken away. It was the hollow, suffocating weeping of a boy watching his entire future burn to the ground. I dropped my keys on the counter. The metallic clatter sounded like a gunshot in the silent house, but Julian didn't even flinch. I crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides and dropped to my knees beside him, the physical ache of my 14-hour shift vanishing entirely. "Jules, buddy, what is it? What happened?" He couldn't speak. He just turned the laptop screen toward me with trembling hands. His knuckles were white. It was an email from the admissions office at Le Cordon Bleu in Paris, carbon copied to Chef Maurice. The subject line read, "Confirmation of withdrawal and scholarship reallocation." I squinted at the screen, my tired eyes struggling to process the neat, sterile, corporate font. The email confirmed receipt of a formal withdrawal request submitted by Julian's legal guardian. It expressed deep regret that he would not be joining the summer intensive program, and formally announced that his coveted spot, and the funding attached to it, had already been passed down to the first runner-up. The decision was final, non-reversible. A cold numbness started at the base of my neck and spread downward. It didn't make sense. Julian had been practically vibrating with excitement just 24 hours ago. He hadn't sent this. I hadn't sent this. Before I could ask another question, the steady, rhythmic tapping of expensive slippers sounded on the hardwood stairs. Evelyn walked into the kitchen. She was wearing her favorite silk robe, her hair wrapped in a specialized microfiber towel. In one hand, she held a small glass jar of some imported anti-aging cream, casually dabbing a thick white layer of it onto her cheekbones. She didn't look surprised to see me kneeling on the floor. She didn't look concerned about our son, who was hyperventilating into his own knees a few feet away. She just looked mildly annoyed, like we were blocking her path to the coffee maker. "Evelyn," I said, my words coming out thick and heavy. "What is this?" "The academy just sent Julian an email saying his guardian withdrew his acceptance." She didn't stop massaging the cream into her skin. She didn't even meet my eyes. "I know. I sent the email last night after you left for your shift. I also called the bank this morning." I stood up, the velvet box still gripped in my hand so hard I thought the wood inside might splinter. "You called the bank? To transfer the $12,000 from the joint account into my personal checking, she replied, finally capping the small glass jar. She leaned against the kitchen island, crossing her arms. I used my status as his mother to decline the offer. It's done, Will. So you can stop glaring at me. I have spent decades standing next to industrial furnaces that can melt steel into glowing liquid. I know exactly what raw, destructive heat feels like. But the anger that flooded my veins in that kitchen wasn't hot. It was absolute zero. It was a freezing, paralyzing clarity. You stole his money, I whispered, the reality of her betrayal settling into the room like a physical weight. You stole his future. Evelyn rolled her eyes, a sharp, ugly gesture that contorted her face. She looked down at Julian, who was staring up at her with red, swollen eyes. There was no maternal warmth in her gaze. There was only a chilling, narcissistic calculation. Stop crying like a little girl, she snapped, her voice echoing off the tile. Baking is a waste of time. He belongs in a factory just like you, Will. I needed that money for my surgery. I deserve to feel beautiful after ruining my body for this family. The words hung in the air. He belongs in a factory. She wasn't just destroying his dream. She was doing it out of pure, concentrated vanity. She had looked at the hundreds of hours our son had spent honing a craft, mastering a delicate art, and she had crushed it under her heel just so she could have a flatter stomach and tighter skin to show off to a bunch of superficial housewives at the country club. She had traded his ticket to Paris for a cosmetic surgeon's scalpel. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the velvet box. I learned a long time ago, on the assembly line, that throwing a tantrum doesn't fix a broken machine. It just gets you fired. I looked at the woman I had shared a bed with for 16 years, and the last frayed thread of my marriage quietly snapped. I didn't see a wife anymore. I didn't even see the mother of my child. I saw a malignant tumor. And you don't negotiate with a tumor. You cut it out. Evelyn let out an exasperated sigh, grabbed her designer purse from the counter, and jingled her car keys. I have a gel manicure appointment, she announced, stepping carefully around Julian, as if he were a puddle of spilled milk. She didn't want to ruin her slippers on. Don't expect me back for lunch. And Will, tell him to clean up this kitchen. It's depressing. The heavy mahogany front door clicked shut behind her, followed by the distant hum of her SUV starting in the driveway. I knelt back down on the cold linoleum. I put the velvet box on the floor and wrapped my arms around my son. He buried his face in my grease-stained work jacket, his tears soaking right through the heavy canvas fabric. I held him there for a long time, letting him grieve the death of the thing he loved most. I felt the sharp angles of his shoulders, shaking against my chest, and I made a quiet, immovable vow to the universe. I pulled back just enough to look him in the eyes. I wiped a tear from his cheek with a rough, calloused thumb. Listen to me, Jules, I said, my tone carrying the heavy, unyielding weight of an iron anvil. You are going to Paris. I don't care what it takes. I will bet my life on it. What I didn't know yet was exactly how deep her financial betrayal went, but I was about to find out, and the paper trail she left behind was going to give me the exact weapon I needed. Weapon I needed. I walked Julian up to his bedroom and made him lie down. I set the velvet box of carbon steel knives on his nightstand, a silent promise resting next to his alarm clock. He was exhausted, drained entirely of the vibrant energy that usually fueled his early morning baking sessions. Once his breathing leveled out into a deep, heavy sleep, I closed his door and walked straight into the small spare bedroom we used as a home office. It was 8:45 a.m. I had been awake for 26 hours, but the adrenaline pumping through my system made the fatigue irrelevant. I am a foreman. My entire professional life is built on diagnosing systemic failures. When a massive hydraulic press stops working on the assembly line, you don't stand around yelling at the machine. You get the blueprints, you trace the wiring, and you find the exact valve that blew. I sat down at our desktop computer, the fan whirring to life, in the quiet house. My hands, still bearing the faint, dark stains of industrial grease, hovered over the keyboard. First, I needed to secure the perimeter. I found the business card Julian had pinned to the corkboard above the desk and dialed the local branch of Le Cordon Bleu. It took 3 transfers before I finally heard the deep, slightly accented voice of Chef Maurice. "William," Maurice said, his tone thick with genuine sorrow. "I cannot tell you how devastated I was to receive the withdrawal. Julian is a rare talent, a generational palate, but the board has strict protocols. Once a guardian declines the scholarship, the funds are immediately earmarked for the first alternate. Maurice, listen to me carefully," I said, leaning forward in the cheap office chair. "Julian did not decline that offer. I did not decline it. The email you received was fraudulent. It was sent without my consent, and I am currently initiating an investigation into the financial side of this mess." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint clatter of pots and pans in the background of his kitchen. "Fraudulent," Maurice repeated, his voice dropping an octave. "William, that is a very serious accusation. The paperwork we received was digitally signed." "Give me 48 hours, I requested, my grip tightening on the phone receiver. "Don't send the official confirmation to the alternate yet. Just hold the spot off the books for 2 days. If I can't prove to you that Julian's spot was stolen by Friday morning, you can give it away." Another heavy pause. Then, a heavy sigh. 48 hours, William. For the boy's sake, but not a minute longer. I hung up the phone and immediately opened the web browser. I logged into our joint banking portal. Evelyn was careless, arrogant in her belief that I was too exhausted from my factory shifts to ever double-check her bookkeeping. The screen loaded, and there it was. A gaping $12,000 hole where my son's living expenses used to be. But she had lied to my face in the kitchen. She hadn't transferred the money into her personal checking account. I clicked on the transaction details. The money had been wired directly into a corporate merchant account, Dr. Vance's Aesthetic Clinic, Birmingham, Michigan. Beside the transaction ID, in the memo line were 3 devastating words: non-refundable surgical deposit. I opened the email client next. I bypassed the inbox and went straight to her sent folder. There was the email to the academy. I downloaded the attached PDF, the official withdrawal form. I stared at the screen, my jaw clenching so hard my teeth ached. At the bottom of the form, on the line designated for the primary guardian's signature, was my name. But it wasn't just typed out in a standard font. It was a digital rendering of my actual physical signature. She had scanned a copy of our joint tax return from 2 years ago, cropped out my signature, and pasted it onto the PDF before locking the document. It was an incredibly stupid, brazen move. She thought she was just shuffling family money around. She didn't realize that forging my signature on a document submitted to an accredited international institution to reroute $12,000 of conditionally granted funds wasn't just a dirty trick. It was textbook wire fraud. I sat there in the dusty glow of the monitor, looking at the irrefutable evidence of her crime. My wife had committed a felony to get a tummy tuck. In my mind's eye, a sharp, bitter contrast played out. I pictured my own hands, rough, scarred, currently resting on a cheap plastic mouse in a cramped room, hands that had spent nearly 2 decades maneuvering heavy, dangerous steel just to build a cushion for this family. Then, I pictured Evelyn, sitting in a plush leather massage chair at the upscale salon, downtown, right at this very moment. I could almost see her delicate hands soaking in a bowl of warm rose water, her eyes closed in blissful relaxation, complaining to her manicurist about how unrefined her husband was. She had taken the literal sweat off my back and the brilliant, hard-won future of our child and traded it all for an illusion of high society youth. I didn't feel sadness anymore. The grief over my dead marriage had evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, methodical focus. I printed the forged PDF. I printed the bank wire transfer confirmation. I printed the IP address logs from the email client, showing exactly what time and from which device the fraud was committed. I gathered the papers and placed them into a neat, manila folder. Evelyn wanted to play a game of appearances. She wanted to look wealthy, flawless, and untouchable to the country club elite. I wasn't going to call the police and have her arrested in her pajamas. That was too private, too easy. If she wanted to trade my son's dream for a luxury aesthetic experience, I was going to make sure she paid the bill in full. In front of the exact audience she was trying to impress. Pause here for a second If you've ever had someone look you dead in the eye and lie to you about money they didn't earn, you know the exact kind of cold that settles into your chest in a moment like this. If you want to see exactly how a blue-collar mechanic dismantles a high society scam, hit the subscribe button. The algorithm needs to know that stories like this, where the quiet guy finally strikes back, matter. I picked up the manila folder, locked the computer, and walked to my bedroom to change out of my grease-stained uniform. I had an appointment to make in Birmingham. I walked into the bathroom and turned the shower dial all the way to cold. I stood under the freezing spray for 10 minutes, letting the ice water shock the 26 hours of exhaustion out of my nervous system. I scrubbed my hands with the heavy pumice stone. I kept on the edge of the tub, trying to get the darkest layers of industrial grease out from under my fingernails. It didn't entirely work, it never does. But I needed to look like a man who was awake, aware, and completely in control. I put on a clean pair of dark jeans and a faded, ironed denim button-down. Before I left the house, I made a brief phone call to the plant manager. I had 18 years of unblemished attendance and 400 hours of accrued sick leave. I told him I needed a week off, effective immediately, for a family emergency. He didn't ask questions. The drive to Birmingham took 45 minutes, transitioning from the gray, pragmatic concrete of the industrial sector into a world of manicured oak trees, sprawling dated driveways, and boutique shopping districts. The parking lot of Dr. Vance's aesthetic clinic was a showroom of European luxury. I slid my dented 10-year-old Ford pickup truck into a spot between a pristine white Range Rover and a sleek silver Porsche. The clinic itself looked less like a medical facility and more like a modern art museum dedicated to vanity. The facade was all frosted glass and brushed aluminum. Inside, the floors were imported white marble, gleaming under the soft, recessed lighting. The air smelled faintly of lavender and expensive green tea. I walked up to the reception desk. The young woman sitting behind it wore a pristine white uniform and had lips that looked entirely too full for her face. She looked up from her dual monitors, her eyes darting quickly over my worn work boots and the fading fabric of my shirt. Her customer service smile didn't quite reach her eyes. It was the look of someone silently determining that you were in the wrong tax bracket to be standing in her lobby. "Can I help you, sir?" "Delivery is around the back," she said, her voice dripping with practiced politeness. I placed both of my calloused hands flat on the polished quartz counter. "I'm not a delivery driver. I need to speak with the financial director of this clinic, right now." She blinked, clearly thrown off script. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Spit," clearly thrown off script. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Day, Hayes requires an appointment. If you have a billing question, I can direct you to—" "I have a legal question," I interrupted, keeping my tone perfectly level, exactly the way I speak when a high-pressure valve is about to fail on the factory floor and people need to evacuate immediately. "My name is William Barrett. Your clinic received a wire transfer of $12,000 yesterday afternoon from my account. If Mr. Hayes doesn't sit down with me in the next 3 minutes, my next conversation is going to be with the Federal Fraud Division." Her polite smile vanished entirely. She picked up the sleek desk phone and dialed an extension, whispering frantically while keeping her eyes locked on me. Less than a minute later, a man in a sharply tailored navy suit emerged from a set of frosted glass doors down the hall. Mr. Hayes looked exactly like a man who spent his life extracting large sums of cash from wealthy, insecure women. He extended a manicured hand, which I ignored, and ushered me into his private office. "Mr. Barrett, I assure you, whatever misunderstanding has occurred, we can resolve it," Hayes said smoothly, settling into his high-backed leather chair. "Our receptionist mentioned something about a wire transfer. I see here that your wife, Evelyn Barrett, has a mommy makeover procedure scheduled for tomorrow morning. I must remind you that all surgical deposits are strictly non-refundable within 48 hours of the operation." I didn't sit down. I didn't want to get comfortable. I unclasped the manila folder and laid the documents out on his immaculate glass desk, one by one. "I'm fully aware of your policy, Mr. Hayes," I said, "but your policy only applies to legal transactions." I tapped the first page. "This is a forged document, submitted to an international educational institution, bearing a digital copy of my signature that my wife pasted from a tax return. It illegally diverted a conditionally granted scholarship stipend. I tapped the second page. This is the IP log, proving it was done from my home network while I was at work. I tapped the final page. And this is the wire transfer showing that $12,000 of stolen, misappropriated funds were deposited directly into this clinic's merchant account yesterday at 2:15 p.m. Hayes leaned forward, his practiced, slick demeanor cracking as he read over the forged signature and the IP logs. The color began to drain from his face. This isn't a marital dispute over a credit card bill, Mr. Hayes. I continued, leaning over the desk so he had to look me in the eye. This is federal wire fraud. That money belongs to Le Cordon Bleu and my son. If Dr. Vance puts my wife on an operating table tomorrow, this clinic becomes a willing participant in the laundering of stolen funds. You will be named in a federal lawsuit, and I will personally make sure every local news station in Birmingham has a copy of this folder. How many of your elite clients do you think will keep coming here when the FBI starts seizing your financial records? You shut the entire line down because the liability is too high. I had just showed this man that his safety guard was gone. Hayes swallowed hard. He looked at the paperwork, then back at me. He was a numbers man, and he was running the cost-benefit analysis in real time. $12,000 was pocket change to a clinic like this. A federal fraud scandal, however, would destroy them overnight. What exactly do you want, Mr. Barrett? He asked, his voice noticeably thinner. I want the transaction reversed, in full. Back into the account of origin, I instructed. Right now, before I leave this room. Hayes didn't argue. He turned to his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Within 2 minutes, the printer in the corner of the office hummed to life. He handed me a warm, freshly printed receipt, confirming the full refund of $12,000 had been initiated and successfully routed back to my bank. I folded the receipt and put it in my front pocket. I picked up my manila folder and turned toward the door. Mr. Barrett, Hayes called out, holding the phone receiver in his hand. I should call your wife to inform her that tomorrow's surgery has been officially canceled due to lack of payment. I stopped in the doorway and looked back at him. No, I said, a dark, quiet satisfaction finally settling in my chest. Don't call her. Let her show up tomorrow morning. Let her put the gown on. What I didn't know yet was exactly how beautifully the scene would play out, but I knew I wouldn't miss it for the world. I sat in the cab of my truck, the engine off. The windows rolled down to let in the cool morning air. Across the street, Evelyn's pristine white SUV pulled into the reserved patient parking lot of Dr. Vance's aesthetic clinic. I watched her step out wearing oversized designer sunglasses and carrying a leather tote bag, looking like she owned the world. I poured a cup of bitter, lukewarm coffee from my battered thermos, my hands, rough and permanently scarred from years of gripping steel wrenches and welding torches wrapped around the cheap plastic lid. I thought about those hands. I thought about the thousands of hours they had spent working in the deafening, dangerous heat of the factory floor. Every drop of sweat, every burned knuckle, had been a deposit into my family's future. And I thought about Evelyn, walking into a climate-controlled, lavender-scented palace to trade my son's life's work for a superficial surgical procedure. I gave her exactly 45 minutes. I wanted her to get comfortable. I wanted her to check in, fill out the intake forms, and be escorted into the VIP pre-op lounge. I wanted her to change out of her street clothes and into one of those absurdly plush clinic-branded silk robes. I wanted her to sit in a leather massage chair and actually start tasting the vanity she had stolen for. At exactly 9:15 a.m., I opened my truck door, stepped onto the pavement, and crossed the street. The waiting room of the clinic was an amphitheater of Birmingham's elite. Half a dozen women in expensive athleisure wear and heavy diamond tennis bracelets sat on velvet sofas, idly flipping through fashion magazines and sipping infused water. I walked past them, my heavy work boots thudding against the imported white marble. I didn't belong here, and the receptionist's terrified glance confirmed it. But she remembered me from yesterday, and she wisely stayed silent. Evelyn wasn't in the main lobby. She was in the semi-private pre-op lounge, just beyond a decorative glass partition, visible to anyone who cared to look. She was exactly where I pictured her, reclining in a massage chair, wrapped in silk, holding a flute of cucumber water in one hand and a glossy catalog of surgical profiles in the other. Her eyes were closed, a serene, victorious smile playing on her lips. It was the face of a woman who believed she had outsmarted a fool and crushed a child's dream without consequence. I stood just outside the partition as a senior floor nurse, a severe-looking woman with a clipboard, approached Evelyn's chair. Evelyn opened her eyes and smiled radiantly, setting her water glass down. "Is Dr. Vance ready for me?" I'm so excited I could burst. The nurse did not smile back. She looked deeply uncomfortable, shifting her weight. "Mrs. Barrett, I'm afraid there has been a severe complication with your file. We need you to return to the dressing room, collect your belongings, and vacate the premises." Evelyn's smile froze, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "Excuse me? What kind of complication? My blood work was perfect." "It is not a medical issue, Mom," the nurse said. She tried to keep her voice down, but the acoustics of the marble room betrayed her. "Your financial clearance was revoked this morning. The $12,000 wire transfer used to secure your non-refundable deposit was flagged and entirely reversed due to a report of fraudulent origin. We cannot and will not proceed with the surgery." Evelyn's face flushed a violent, blotchy red. She stood up abruptly, the silk robe slipping slightly off her shoulder. "Fraudulent? Do you have any idea who you are talking to? My husband is paying for this. Let me speak to Mr. Hayes right now. This is a ridiculous banking error." "It's not an error, Evelyn." I stepped through the partition doorway. The entire waiting room went dead, silent. The women on the velvet sofas stopped flipping their magazines. Every eye in the clinic locked onto us. Evelyn spun around, her eyes widening in a mixture of absolute shock and sheer panic. She looked at my faded denim shirt, my work jeans, and the permanent oil stains etched into the calluses of my hands. She hated when I wore my work clothes in public. She explicitly banned me from coming to this part of town without a suit. And here I was, standing in the middle of her sanctuary of manufactured perfection. "Will?" she hissed, stepping closer and dropping her voice to a frantic, desperate whisper. "What are you doing here? You need to fix this right now. Tell this nurse to run the wire again. They are humiliating me in front of everyone." I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. I didn't pull out a checkbook. I pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila envelope and dropped it onto the glass coffee table between us. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud that echoed in the quiet room. "I can't run the wire again," I said. My voice was steady and perfectly calibrated, projecting clearly across the room so that every single woman in that lobby could hear the truth. At 8:01 a.m. this morning, the moment the bank opened, I authorized a certified cashier's check. That $12,000 is currently sitting in the endowment account of the Le Cordon Bleu Academy. It is completely locked, legally tethered to Julian's tuition file. Evelyn stared at me, the blood completely draining from her face, leaving her pale and trembling. You did what?" "I found your little cut-and-paste project on the home computer," I continued, holding her gaze, refusing to let her look away. "I saw how you forged my signature to steal from your own son, to sabotage his future, just so you could buy a tighter waistline to show off to people who don't even care if you exist." "Keep your voice down," she pleaded, tears of sheer, unadulterated humiliation welling up in her eyes. She darted a frantic look toward the other women in the lobby, who were now watching the spectacle with undisguised fascination. Her carefully constructed high society facade was shattering into a million jagged pieces right in front of her. "That envelope doesn't have bank statements in it," I said, ignoring her plea. "It has divorce papers. I've already spoken to my attorney. You are going to sign them, and you are going to pack your bags and leave the house by the end of the week. The deed has been in my name since before we met. You don't get the house, and you most certainly do not get the boy." The reality of her situation finally crashed down on her. Not remorse for what she had done to Julian, but the agonizing realization that she was financially ruined, publicly exposed, and sitting in a clinic robe with nowhere to go. "You're a miserable, greasy factory worker," she spat, her voice cracking, dropping the last pretense of civility as venom took over. "You're going to ruin my life over some stupid flour and sugar." I looked at her, I looked at the frantic, shallow emptiness that had consumed the woman I had married. I had spent my life around heavy machinery. I knew the value of stepping back and letting a failing engine destroy itself. I felt absolutely nothing but the quiet, rhythmic peace of a machine finally running in perfect alignment. The smell of machine oil on me can be washed off, Evelyn, I said quietly, the finality of the words hanging heavy in the sterile air. But the rot inside you? There is no surgical blade sharp enough to cut that away. I turned my back on her and walked out of the clinic, the sound of my heavy boots echoing on the marble. I'd remember that moment later, for all the right reasons. When you dismantle a broken machine on the factory floor, you don't just rip it apart. You unbolt it piece by piece, isolating the damaged components so they can never cause a catastrophic failure again. That is exactly how I handled the end of my marriage. The divorce was finalized with a brutal, quiet efficiency. When you possess irrefutable proof of federal wire fraud, digital forgery, and a documented money trail, legal negotiations tend to be exceptionally brief. Evelyn's high-priced divorce attorney, a man she had likely promised to pay with a generous share of my retirement fund, took one look at the printed IP logs and the aesthetic clinic's refund receipt. He didn't even attempt to mount a defense. He simply pulled Evelyn into the hallway and advised her to take whatever terms I offered, lest I walk that manila folder straight to the district attorney's office. I offered exactly nothing. The deed to the house had been in my name long before I ever put a ring on her finger. The bank accounts were legally separated. The same afternoon I visited the clinic, she was given 48 hours to pack her designer clothes, her expensive cosmetics, and leave. She drove away in her pristine SUV, quickly discovering that her wealthy country club friends had absolutely no interest in associating with a woman who had been publicly humiliated, financially cut off, and exposed as a fraud in the middle of their favorite VIP lounge. Reality caught up with her fast. Today, Evelyn lives in a cramped one-bedroom walk-up apartment on the grittier side of the county. The irony of her new life is almost poetic. The woman who endlessly despised the working class, who looked at my grease-stained hands and told our son that manual labor was a failure's path, now clocks in 40 hours a week at a customer service call center. She spends her days wearing a cheap foam headset, forced to speak politely from a mandated script to angry strangers complaining about their utility bills. There are no silk robes. There is no luxury mommy makeover. There is only the harsh, flickering fluorescent lighting of a cubicle and the crushing, inescapable weight of her own choices. But this story isn't about her downfall. Her ruin was just the necessary byproduct of securing my son's future. This story is about the boy who stayed up until dawn, covered in flour, trying to build something beautiful. 1 month later, the deafening metallic roar of the hydraulic presses at my factory was replaced by the low, echoing hum of the International Departure Terminal. The air inside the airport smelled of roasted coffee, floor wax, and jet fuel. I stood near the security checkpoint, watching a sea of travelers rolling their luggage toward their respective gates. Beside me stood Julian. He looked fundamentally different than the boy I had found crying on the kitchen floor. The heavy, suffocating despair was completely gone. In its place was a nervous electric energy that seemed to radiate from him. He had his blue passport clutched tightly in his left hand, and his boarding pass to Paris in his right, safely stowed away in the belly of the plane. Carefully wrapped in his checked luggage was the velvet box containing his custom carbon steel pastry knives. I reached out and adjusted the strap of his heavy canvas backpack, my thick fingers brushing against the collar of his jacket. I looked down at my hands. They were still stained with the permanent dark grease of the assembly line. The calluses were still thick and unyielding. And then I looked at his hands, clean, steady, and ready to create art that I couldn't even begin to comprehend. The stark contrast between our worlds used to worry me. I used to fear that my rough life would drag him down. Now, standing in the terminal, that contrast felt like the proudest achievement of my life. My steel and sweat had built the foundation, so his art could take flight. Julian turned to face me. He didn't mention the clinic. He didn't bring up his mother, or the ugly, fractured reality of what our family had become. The past was a closed book. He just stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me in a tight, fierce hug. "Thank you, Dad," he whispered, his voice thick with a profound, unspoken understanding of exactly what it took to get him here. For everything. Make sure you pay attention to Chef Maurice's colleagues. I told him, my voice gruff but warm, patting him solidly on the back. Learn everything they have to teach you. And do me a favor. Don't forget to eat something other than sugar while you're over there. He pulled back, a brilliant, radiant smile breaking across his face. He nodded, wiped a single tear from his eye, and turned toward the security line. I stood there near the glass partition for a long time, watching his silhouette move through the checkpoint and eventually disappear into the massive crowd of departing passengers. My shift at the auto plant started in 6 hours. I would drive back to the industrial sector, walk through the heavy metal doors, and return to the ozone, the noise and the cold steel. But tonight, the work wouldn't feel heavy. I would do it, knowing that my son was flying toward the sun, untethered and unstoppable. We cannot choose the people who bring us into this world, but as fathers, we always have the exact right and the profound duty to choose how we protect the wings of those trying to rise. Before you move on to the next video, I want you to think about the people in your life who stood between you and a broken dream. If you had a father, a mother, a mentor, or anyone who sacrificed their own comfort to make sure you could fly, drop a comment below and honor their story. And if you believe that the quiet, unyielding strength of a parent will always outlast the loud, selfish vanity of a narcissist, hit that subscribe button. Let's keep building a community that values the honest sweat of a hard day's work over the fragile illusion of a perfect life. Until next time, take care of your own.